Richard Collins settled into his leather seat in first class with a sigh of relief. Another business trip, another 5-hour flight. But at least up here in the front of the plane, he could pretend he wasn't crammed in a metal tube with 200 other people. At 62, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit that cost more than some people's monthly rent, Richard had grown accustomed to a certain level of comfort when traveling. He placed his expensive briefcase under the seat, in front of him, pulled out the Wall Street Journal and signaled to the flight attendant for his usual pre-takeoff scotch. Richard had flown this route between New York and Los Angeles at least twice a month for the past 15 years. The first-class cabin was practically his second office. "Good afternoon, Mr. Collins," said Heather, a flight attendant who recognized him from his frequent trips. "The usual McAllen 18? Richard nodded without looking up from his newspaper. "No ice." As Heather walked away, the sound of children's excited voices broke through the usual quiet hum of the first-class cabin. Richard lowered his paper, annoyance flashing across his face. 2 children around 8 and 10 years old were bouncing into the cabin, followed by their parents. "Look at these seats, Dad. They're huge," the younger child exclaimed, running his hand over the soft leather. "Remember what we talked about," the father said gently. "Inside voices even when we're excited." Richard watched with growing displeasure as the black family settled into the row across from him. The father was tall and carried himself with quiet confidence, dressed in a simple but neat button-down shirt and slacks. The mother wore a colorful dress and moved with grace, helping her daughter get situated, while the boy continued to explore every button and compartment in his seat. "Can I get the window, Mom, please?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Of course, honey. This is a special trip for all of us," the mother replied with a warm smile. Richard sniffed loudly and turned his attention back to his newspaper, though he wasn't really reading anymore. In his 20 years of flying first class, he rarely saw families up here, especially not ones that looked like they'd wandered in from the back of the plane. When Heather returned with his scotch, Richard beckoned her closer. "I think there might be some confusion," he said in a stage whisper that carried farther than necessary. "Did they open boarding for all passengers already? Those people seem to be in the wrong section." Heather's professional smile tightened, slightly. "Everyone in this cabin has a first-class ticket, sir." "Are you sure? They don't look like they fly first class," Richard persisted, making no effort to lower his voice. "Maybe they got upgraded because the flight was oversold or something." The mother across the aisle stiffened, clearly overhearing. The father placed his hand gently on hers, a silent gesture of support. The children, oblivious to the tension, continued exploring their spacious surroundings. "I can assure you, sir, they're in the correct seats," Heather replied firmly before moving to welcome other passengers. Richard muttered something about standards these days and took a long sip of his scotch. When another flight attendant came by to offer pre-flight drinks to the family across from him, he watched with narrowed eyes. "Would you like champagne to start your flight?" the attendant asked. "No, thank you," the father replied. "Just water for my wife and me. The kids would love apple juice, though, if you have it." "Of course, sir, and we have our special first-class snack baskets, too. Would your children prefer the fruit option or the cheese and crackers?" The kid's eyes lit up at the mention of snacks. "Can we have both?" the boy asked hopefully. "Michael," his mother said with a gentle warning tone. "One each today," the father compromised. "You can try the other kind on our flight back home." As the flight attendant walked away to get their drinks, Richard couldn't contain himself any longer. He leaned across the aisle toward the family. "First time in first class?" he asked, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The father turned to him with a measured look. "The kids haven't flown in first class before, that's right?" "I thought so," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. "It's quite different up here from what you're probably used to." The mother's expression hardened, but the father remained calm. "I'm sure we'll manage to figure it out. It's just that there's a certain etiquette," Richard continued, glancing meaningfully at the children. "People up here expect a quiet, peaceful experience. We pay a premium for it after all, as did we," the mother said coolly. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Really? All 4 of you? That must have been quite an investment." His emphasis on the last word made it clear he doubted they had actually paid for their seats. The boarding process continued around them, with more passengers filing into the first-class cabin. A few gave curious glances at the increasingly tense exchange. "Our money works just like yours does," the father said evenly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're trying to enjoy this experience with our children." Richard scoffed. "I'm just saying, some people work their whole lives to afford certain privileges. It's not the same when things are just handed to you." The implication hung in the air. The mother took a deep breath, visibly restraining herself from responding. The father's jaw tightened, but he turned his attention back to his children who were now sensing the tension. "Is something wrong, Dad?" the girl asked quietly. "Not at all, sweetie," he reassured her. "Just grown-up talk. How about we look through the movie choices for our trip?" As the family turned their attention to the entertainment options, Richard sat back with a self-satisfied smirk and returned to his newspaper. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, completing pre-flight preparations, their professional smiles not quite reaching their eyes when they served Richard. Another passenger, a woman in her 40s, boarded and took the seat next to Richard. She smiled at the family across the aisle as she settled in. "First time in first class for the little ones?" she asked warmly. "How exciting." The children's faces lit up again, and the mother relaxed slightly. "Yes, it's a special trip. We're heading to Los Angeles for a business thing, but we're making it a family vacation too." "That sounds wonderful," the woman replied. "I always say, what's the point of success if you can't share it with the people you love?" Richard shifted, uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. As the final boarding call was announced, a flurry of activity near the front of the cabin caught everyone's attention. A flight attendant was speaking with the captain, who had emerged from the cockpit. They both glanced in the direction of the family. The captain, a distinguished-looking man with graying temples, approached the family with a broad smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington, I just wanted to introduce myself personally. It's an honor to have you on board today." Richard's head snapped up from his newspaper, his brow furrowed in confusion. The father stood and shook the captain's hand. "Thank you, Captain. We appreciate it, though we were hoping to fly under the radar today." "Of course, sir, I understand completely," the captain said, "but I couldn't miss the chance to welcome you personally. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." As the captain returned to the cockpit, Richard stared at the family with new interest and growing unease. Who were these people that the captain would come out personally to greet them? And why did the flight attendants suddenly seem to be paying extra attention to them? The plane began to push back from the gate, and the usual safety demonstration started. Richard tried to focus on his newspaper, but his eyes kept drifting to the family across the aisle. The father caught him staring once and gave him a small, knowing smile that made Richard shift uncomfortably in his seat. The mother leaned over and whispered something in her husband's ear, and they both glanced at Richard before sharing a quiet laugh. Richard felt a creeping sensation up his neck, a feeling he rarely experienced in his privileged world. Embarrassment. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a serious misjudgment, one that he might soon regret. The plane climbed steadily into the sky, leaving the New York skyline behind. Richard pretended to read his newspaper, but his mind kept wandering back to the strange interaction between the captain and the Washington family. He glanced over his paper, studying them more carefully now. The father was helping his son figure out how to recline his seat, while the mother was showing her daughter how to use the entertainment system. They moved with a quiet confidence that Richard had initially mistaken for awkwardness. Now he wasn't so sure. "Excuse me," Richard said, leaning slightly toward the aisle. The father looked up, his expression neutral. "I couldn't help but notice the captain came out to greet you personally. Are you someone famous I should recognize?" The father smiled slightly. "No, I wouldn't say famous. Just someone who flies this airline frequently." "Oh." Richard paused. "I fly this route twice a month myself, and the captain has never come out to say hello to me." "Maybe you should complain to management," the mother suggested with a hint of amusement in her voice. Before Richard could respond, a flight attendant appeared with a tray of hot towels. "Mr. Washington, Mrs. Washington, Would you and your children like a hot towel before we serve drinks? That would be nice, thank you. The father, Mr. Washington, replied. The flight attendant offered towels to the children first, showing them how to use them to refresh their hands and face. And one for you, Mr. Collins, she added, almost as an afterthought. Richard accepted the towel with a tight smile. He was used to being the most important person in first class, the one who received special attention from the crew. Today, something was off. Once the towels were collected, another flight attendant approached the Washington family with a tablet. Mr. Washington, the chef wanted to know if you'd like to pre-order your family's meals. We have a few special options not on the regular menu today. Richard's eyebrows shot up. Chef? Special menu? In his 15 years of flying this airline, he'd never heard of such treatment. That's very thoughtful, Mr. Washington said. What would you recommend? The chef prepared a grilled salmon with lemon butter sauce that's not on the regular menu. And for the children, we have homemade chicken tenders with sweet potato fries. The Washington children bounced excitedly in their seats. Can we have that, Dad? The boy asked. Sounds perfect, Mr. Washington agreed. And my wife will probably enjoy the salmon as well? Mrs. Washington nodded. That sounds lovely. The flight attendant beamed. Excellent choices, and would you like to select your wines now as well? We've stocked a few bottles of that Pinot Noir you enjoyed on your last flight. Just sparkling water for us today, thank you, Mrs. Washington replied. We don't drink when we're with the children. Of course, I'll let the chef know your preferences. As the flight attendant walked away, Richard couldn't contain himself any longer. There's a chef on board? He asked incredulously. Mr. Washington looked at him with mild surprise. On the transcontinental flights, yes. Haven't you had the chance to try the special menu before? Richard felt his face grow warm. No, I've always ordered from the standard menu. Well, you should ask next time, Mrs. Washington suggested. They're usually happy to accommodate regular customers. The emphasis on regular wasn't lost on Richard. He turned back to his newspaper, feeling increasingly wrong-footed. A few minutes later, the drink service began. The flight attendant started with the Washington family, bringing juice boxes with colorful straws for the children and sparkling water with lemon for the parents. And for you, Mr. Collins? Another scotch? The flight attendant asked when she reached him. Yes, he muttered. Double this time. As Richard sipped his scotch, he noticed other passengers in first class giving curious glances toward the Washington family. A businessman 2 rows ahead kept looking back, trying to place where he might have seen Mr. Washington before. A woman across the aisle was whispering to her seatmate while nodding subtly in their direction. The feeling that he was missing something important gnawed at Richard. He pulled out his phone, enabled the airplane mode, and opened his browser to check his downloaded news articles. Perhaps there was something about a celebrity or athlete named Washington that he had missed. Finding nothing in his recent downloads, Richard put his phone away and decided on a more direct approach. He turned to the woman seated next to him, who had greeted the Washington family warmly earlier. Excuse me, he said quietly. Do you know who that family is? Everyone seems to be treating them like VIPs. The woman gave him an odd look. You really don't know? Richard shook his head, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. That's David Washington, she said, as if the name should mean something to him. When Richard's expression remained blank, she added, The CEO of Pine Tree Holdings? The company that just acquired this airline last month? Richard felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the cabin. Pine Tree Holdings was one of the largest investment firms in the country, known for acquiring struggling companies and turning them around. He had read about their recent acquisition of the airline in the Wall Street Journal, but hadn't paid attention to the details about the CEO. Are you sure? He asked weakly. The woman nodded. Absolutely. I work for one of their subsidiary companies. I recognized him right away. That's why I was so surprised to see him flying commercial, even if it is in first class. He could easily have taken the company's private jet. Richard took a long sip of his scotch, his mind racing. He had just spent the past half hour belittling the new owner of the airline he flew twice a month. The man who could, with a single word, revoke his frequent flyer status, his priority boarding, his automatic upgrades, all the perks he had come to take for granted. Looks like he's traveling incognito with his family, the woman continued, oblivious to Richard's growing panic. Probably checking out the customer experience firsthand. That's his style. He likes to see things from the ground level before making changes. Richard's stomach churned. Changes? What kind of changes would Washington implement after being treated rudely by a first-class passenger? The flight attendant returned with another round of drinks for the Washington family, this time bringing a small plate of fresh fruit cut into fun shapes for the children. "We didn't order this," Mrs. Washington said, surprised. "Compliments of the crew," the flight attendant replied with a warm smile. "We're so happy to have you all with us today." Richard watched as the Washington children thanked the flight attendant with perfect manners. The boy carefully selected a star-shaped watermelon piece while the girl chose a grape skewer. "Would you like some fruit, Mr. Collins?" the flight attendant asked, not offering him the special plate but gesturing to the regular first-class snack basket instead. "No, thank you," Richard replied, his appetite gone. The cabin fell into a lull as passengers settled into their entertainment choices, or work. Richard couldn't focus on his newspaper or the movie screen. His mind kept replaying his earlier comments. Had he really suggested they didn't belong in first class? Had he actually implied they couldn't afford their tickets? The memory made him cringe. After about an hour into the flight, Mr. Washington stood up to stretch his legs. Richard tensed as the man walked past his seat toward the lavatory. When Mr. Washington returned a few minutes later, he paused in the aisle next to Richard's seat. "Enjoying your flight, sir?" Mr. Washington asked pleasantly. Richard looked up, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, thank you," he managed to say. "Good to hear. I'm David Washington, by the way." He extended his hand. Richard had no choice but to shake it. "Richard Collins." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Collins. I noticed from your conversation with the crew that you're a frequent flyer with us." "Yes, twice a month for the past 15 years, Richard confirmed, trying to sound casual despite his racing heart. "Impressive. Loyalty." Mr. Washington nodded. "We appreciate customers like you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the service sometime. Customer feedback is invaluable, especially from those who fly with us regularly." Richard swallowed hard. "The service has always been excellent, glad to hear it, though there's always room for improvement, wouldn't you agree?" Mr. Washington's smile remained friendly, but his eyes held a knowing look. "Especially when it comes to making all our passengers feel equally welcome and valued." The emphasis on all hung in the air between them. Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead. "Absolutely," he agreed weakly. "Well, enjoy the rest of your flight, Mr. Collins. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again." With a final nod, Mr. Washington returned to his family. Richard sank back into his seat, reaching for his scotch with a slightly trembling hand. The white woman next to him leaned over. "You didn't know who he was when you were speaking to his family earlier, did you?" she whispered, having overheard their exchange. Richard shook his head miserably. "Oh dear," she said, not bothering to hide her amusement. "That might make your future flights with this airline a bit awkward." As if on cue, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at an altitude of 36,000 feet. The weather ahead looks clear and we expect to arrive in Los Angeles on schedule. On behalf of the entire crew, I'd like to extend a special welcome to the Washington family. Mr. Washington, we're honored to have you and your family experiencing our service firsthand today." All eyes in the first-class cabin turned toward the Washington family. Mr. Washington gave a small, gracious wave of acknowledgement while his wife smiled beside him. The children, excited to be mentioned by the captain, bounced in their seats. Richard wanted nothing more than to disappear into his seat. He caught Mr. Washington's eye briefly, and the CEO gave him a small nod, polite, professional, but with an unmistakable message. "I won't forget our interaction." As the meal service began with the Washington family being served first from their special menu, Richard realized with growing dread that his comfortable first-class world had just become much, much more complicated. The meal service was in full swing, and Richard had never felt more uncomfortable on a flight. The Washington family was served first, their special meals arriving on real china with proper silverware. The children's faces lit up at their gourmet chicken tenders, which looked nothing like the frozen variety Richard had expected. The salmon for Mr. and Mrs. Washington came garnished with fresh herbs and accompanied by roasted vegetables that filled the cabin with a mouth-watering aroma. When the flight attendant finally reached Richard, she placed a tray in front of him, with significantly less ceremony. "The chicken or pasta you pre-ordered, Mr. Collins," she said flatly. Richard looked down at his meal. While it was the same first-class meal he'd eaten dozens of times before, it suddenly looked pedestrian compared to the Washington's custom dishes. "I thought you said there was a chef on board. Could I see the special menu as well?" The flight attendant's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Collins, but those meals were pre-arranged. We only carry a limited number of special meals on each flight." "I see," Richard said, trying to mask his disappointment and embarrassment. He glanced across the aisle where the Washington children were gleefully dipping their chicken tenders into little ramekins of various sauces. "This is amazing, Dad," the boy exclaimed. "Way better than regular plain food." "They make it fresh on board," Mr. Washington explained, cutting into his perfectly cooked salmon. "The chef trained at a famous culinary school in France." The flight attendant who had delivered Richard's meal overheard this. "That's right," she confirmed with a warm smile for the children. "Chef Pierre has been with us for 3 years. He's part of our premium culinary team for first-class transcontinental and international flights." Richard picked at his chicken, which suddenly tasted like cardboard. He'd flown this route countless times and had never once heard about a premium culinary team or a chef named Pierre. How had he missed this perk that was apparently available to other first-class passengers? As the meal service continued, Richard noticed other passengers stealing glances at the Washington family. Some looked curious, others impressed, and a few seemed to be trying to figure out if they could request the special menu for themselves on future flights. Mr. Washington, sensing the attention, handled it with practiced ease. He smiled politely at those who caught his eye, but maintained his focus on his family, helping his daughter cut her food and wiping a smudge of sauce from his son's cheek. "Daddy, can we have ice cream for dessert?" the girl asked, having finished most of her meal. "Let's see what they have," Mr. Washington replied. "But remember, it's a special treat because we're on vacation." On cue, a flight attendant appeared with a dessert cart. "We have our regular first-class dessert options," she announced to the cabin, "and a few special treats as well." She unveiled a selection that included the usual packaged cookies and brownies Richard was familiar with, alongside what appeared to be freshly made desserts, miniature cheesecakes, chocolate lava cakes, and artisanal ice cream in small glass dishes. The Washington children's eyes widened at the display. "Can we have the chocolate one, please?" the boy asked politely. "Excellent choice," the flight attendant said, serving them each a tiny chocolate lava cake topped with a delicate sprig of mint and a quenelle of vanilla ice cream on the side. When the cart reached Richard, he pointed to the lava cake. "I'll have that as well." The flight attendant's smile faltered slightly. "I'm sorry, sir. Those are part of our special menu. Would you like the brownie or the cheese plate from our regular service?" Richard felt his face burn. "The brownie is fine," he muttered, aware that several nearby passengers had witnessed the exchange. The woman seated next to Richard leaned over after the flight attendant moved on. "Don't feel bad," she whispered. "I've been flying this airline for years and never knew about the special menu either. Apparently, it's usually reserved for their top-tier elite members and VIPs. This did nothing to make Richard feel better. He considered himself a VIP passenger. He had platinum status. He flew first class without exception. Yet here he was eating a packaged brownie while the Washington family enjoyed restaurant-quality desserts. Halfway through the brownie, which tasted like disappointment and shame, Richard excused himself to use the lavatory. He needed a moment. away from the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere of the cabin. As he stood waiting for the lavatory to become available, he overheard two flight attendants speaking quietly in the galley. "Can you believe how he talked to the Washingtons before he knew who they were?" one whispered. "Heather told me he practically suggested they didn't belong in first class," the other replied with obvious disapproval, "right before finding out they literally own the airline." "Talk about a career-limiting move," the first one said with a stifled laugh. "I heard Mr. Washington is planning to completely overhaul the frequent flyer program. Wonder if Mr. Collins will keep his status after today." "Well, you know what they say about karma." Richard cleared his throat loudly, and the flight attendants instantly separated, their faces professionally blank. "Can I help you, sir?" one asked, as if they hadn't just been discussing him. "Just waiting for the lavatory," Richard said stiffly. When he returned to his seat a few minutes later, the mood in the cabin had shifted. The Washington children had finished their desserts and were now engaged in a quiet card game their mother had produced from her carry-on bag. Mr. Washington had pulled out a laptop and was reviewing documents with an intensity that suggested important work. Richard tried to focus on his own devices, but his mind kept replaying the flight attendant's conversation. Was his frequent flyer status really at risk? The thought made his stomach churn. He relied on those perks for his business travel. The automatic upgrades, the priority boarding, the exclusive lounges, they were part of what made his frequent travel bearable. After about 20 minutes of silent panic, Richard decided he needed to attempt some damage control. He couldn't undo his earlier rudeness, but perhaps he could minimize its impact with a sincere apology. Taking a deep breath, he stood and stepped into the aisle, approaching the Washington family's row. "Excuse me, Mr. Washington," he said quietly. Mr. Washington looked up from his laptop, his expression neutral. "Yes, Mr. Collins." Richard swallowed hard. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. It was inappropriate and disrespectful, Mr. Washington studied him for a moment. "May I ask what exactly you're apologizing for?" The question caught Richard off guard. He glanced around, aware that several nearby passengers were listening with undisguised interest. For suggesting that you and your family didn't belong in first class," he admitted, the words painful to say aloud. "And why did you think we didn't belong here?" Mr. Washington pressed, his voice calm but firm. Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead. "I made assumptions based on appearances that were unfair and wrong." "I see." Mr. Washington's gaze was steady. "And would you have made those same assumptions if we were white?" The blunt question hung in the air. Richard opened and closed his mouth, no words coming out. The entire first-class cabin seemed to be holding its breath. "That's what I thought," Mr. Washington said finally, breaking the tense silence. "Mr. Collins, I appreciate your apology, but I think we both know it's motivated more by the revelation of who I am than by genuine remorse for your behavior." Richard's face burned with shame. Mrs. Washington, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Our children were so excited about this trip," she said, her voice controlled but with an unmistakable edge. "They've never flown first class before because we usually take our private jet. But we wanted them to experience what regular commercial air travel is like, to keep them grounded in reality." "What an ironic welcome to that reality they received," Mr. Washington added, glancing at his children, who were thankfully still absorbed in their card game and oblivious to the conversation. "I truly am sorry," Richard said, feeling smaller by the second. "I'm sure you are now," Mr. Washington replied. "But your apology doesn't erase the fact that my family and I witnessed a perfect example of why I wanted to acquire this airline in the first place. The customer experience needs a major overhaul, starting with how all passengers are treated regardless of what they look like or what assumptions people make about them." A flight attendant approached, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" "Everything's fine, Claire," Mr. Washington assured her. Mr. Collins was just returning to his seat. Taking the hint, Richard retreated to his seat, aware of the eyes following him. The woman next to him raised an eyebrow but mercifully said, "Nothing." For the next hour, Richard sat in miserable silence, pretending to work on his laptop while actually staring blankly at spreadsheets he couldn't focus on. Across the aisle, the Washington family continued their flight as if the uncomfortable exchange had never happened. The parents working quietly while the children played games and occasionally looked out the window with excitement. Then, without warning, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, at the request of Mr. Washington, I'd like to share some exciting news with you all. As some of you may know, Pine Tree Holdings recently acquired our airline with the promise of enhancing the customer experience across all cabin classes. Today, Mr. Washington has asked me to announce the first of those changes." Richard tensed in his seat, certain that whatever was coming would somehow affect him personally. "Effective immediately," the captain continued, "our frequent flyer program is being completely restructured. The new system will focus not just on miles flown or money spent, but also on customer behavior and interaction scores as reported by our crew members." A murmur ran through the cabin. Richard felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "Mr. Washington believes that true premium service should reflect premium behavior from all parties involved," the captain explained. "In the coming weeks, all of our frequent flyers will receive information about the air updated status under the new program. But as a special treat today, every passenger on this flight will receive a complimentary upgrade to our new Platinum Plus status for 1 year, with one exception." Richard closed his eyes, knowing what was coming. "Mr. Collins in seat 3B, the captain said. "Mr. Washington would like to speak with you privately about your status after we land." The cabin fell silent. All eyes turned to Richard, whose face had gone from red to ashen. Across the aisle, Mr. Washington gave him a small professional nod, his expression unreadable. As the captain signed off and returned to flying the plane, Richard sank deeper into his seat, wishing he could disappear entirely. The woman next to him leaned over one last time. "Word of advice," she whispered, not unkindly. "When you meet with him after landing, try showing some genuine remorse rather than fear for your own privileges. He's actually a very fair man, unless he thinks you're only sorry you got caught." Richard nodded numbly, knowing she was right but unsure if he was capable of the authenticity Mr. Washington would surely see through any attempt to fake. As the plane began its initial descent toward Los Angeles, he wondered how a routine business trip had turned into what might be the most humiliating day of his professional life. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the sprawling city coming into view beneath them. Richard sat rigidly in his seat, his mind racing. He had spent the last hour rehearsing what he might say to Mr. Washington after they landed, but everything sounded hollow and self-serving in his head. Across the aisle, the Washington family seemed completely at ease. The children had put away their card game and were now pressing their faces against the window, pointing excitedly at landmarks below. Mrs. Washington was helping them identify buildings and neighborhoods, while Mr. Washington closed his laptop and stored it in his bag, occasionally joining in their game of aerial sightseeing. "Look, there's the Hollywood sign," the girl exclaimed, bouncing in her seat. "And those buildings downtown, that's where Dad's new office is going to be, right?" the boy asked. "That's right," Mr. Washington confirmed with a smile. "The tall one, with the pointed top. We'll go see it tomorrow during our tour." Richard couldn't help but eavesdrop on their conversation, his anxiety mounting with each passing minute. The casual mention of the new office was another reminder that Mr. Washington wasn't just any CEO. He was the new owner of the airline Richard depended on for his livelihood. The captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their final approach. "Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." As the flight attendants moved through the cabin checking seatbelts and tray tables, one paused by Mr. Washington. "Sir, I've been asked to inform you that there will be representatives meeting you at the gate. They asked if you would like to deplane first." "That won't be necessary," Mr. Washington replied. "We'll exit with everyone else, no special treatment." The flight attendant nodded. "Of course, sir, and regarding Mr. Collins, I'll speak with him at the gate," Mr. Washington said, his voice low, but still audible to Richard. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Part of him had hoped that Mr. Washington would forget about their conversation, or decide it wasn't worth his time. That hope was now dashed, The plane touched down smoothly, rolling along the runway before taxiing toward the terminal. The captain welcomed them to Los Angeles, announcing the local time and weather. As the plane approached the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings, eager to deplane. "Please remain seated until the captain has turned off the seatbelt sign," a flight attendant announced, though several impatient passengers were already standing in the aisles. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the usual rush to exit began. Mr. Washington turned to his family. "Let these folks go ahead," he said, gesturing to the eager passengers crowding the aisle. "We're not in a hurry." Richard remained seated as well, his briefcase clutched tightly on his lap. He watched as the majority of first-class passengers filed out, some giving curious glances toward the Washington family and himself. Finally, when most passengers had departed, Mr. Washington stood and helped his children gather their things. "Honey," he said to his wife, "why don't you take the kids ahead? I need to have a quick word with Mr. Collins." Mrs. Washington nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We'll wait for you in the lounge," she said, ushering the children toward the exit. As she passed Richard's seat, she gave him a look that wasn't unkind but was certainly evaluating. When the Washington family had gone, Mr. Washington took a seat beside Richard. The remaining passengers in economy were still deplaning, creating a steady stream of people moving past them. But the first-class cabin was now empty except for the two men. "Mr. Collins," Mr. Washington began, his voice measured, "I wanted to speak with you privately before you continue your day." Richard nodded stiffly. "I understand. And again, I want to apologize for my behavior earlier." "You know," Mr. Washington said, ignoring the apology for the moment, "when I decided to acquire this airline, many people questioned the decision. The company was struggling, its customer service ratings were dropping, and employee morale was at an all-time low. But I saw potential." Richard remained silent, unsure where this was going. "I believe that how a company treats its most vulnerable or least powerful customers reveals its true character," Mr. Washington continued. "That's why I decided to fly commercial today with my family. I wanted to experience the service firsthand, as a regular customer, not as the CEO." "I see," Richard said quietly. "What I didn't expect was to also witness exactly the kind of behavior that drives people away from air travel. The sense that some passengers are more deserving of respect and service than others, based solely on appearances or assumptions." Richard's face burned with shame. "I was out of line," he admitted. "Yes, you were," Mr. Washington agreed calmly. "But what concerns me more is that you seemed comfortable being out of line until you learned who I was. That suggests the problem isn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a deeper issue with how you view others." The observation struck Richard like a physical blow. He had never thought of himself as prejudiced. He hired people of all backgrounds at his firm. He donated to charity. He considered himself progressive and open-minded. "I don't think of myself that way," Richard said defensively. "Few people do," Mr. Washington replied. "Yet here we are. The question is, what happens now?" Richard swallowed hard. "Are you going to revoke my frequent flyer status?" he asked, immediately regretting how petty the question sounded given the context. Mr. Washington studied him for a moment. "Is that really your primary concern right now? Not the fact that you made my children feel unwelcome in a space they had every right to occupy, or that you embarrassed my wife in front of a plane full of strangers, or that you demonstrated exactly the kind of behavior I'm trying to eliminate from the customer experience at this airline." Put that way, Richard felt even smaller. "No," he said quietly. "You're right. That shouldn't be my main concern. Let me ask you something, Mr. Collins. In your 15 years of flying first class, have you ever had someone question your right to be there? Has anyone ever suggested you must have been accidentally upgraded or couldn't possibly have paid for your ticket?" Richard thought for a moment. "No," he admitted. "My wife and I are successful professionals who can afford to buy this entire airline, let alone first-class tickets, yet we still face those assumptions regularly. That's a reality you've never had to experience." Richard had no response to this undeniable truth. As for your status, Mr. Washington continued, I meant what I said about our new program evaluating more than just miles flown. Customer behavior will be a factor going forward, but I'm not going to make a decision about your specific case based on one bad day. Relief flooded through Richard, followed immediately by shame at feeling relieved, when he should be feeling remorseful. Instead, Mr. Washington said, I have a proposal for you. A proposal? Richard echoed. Yes. Our company foundation runs a mentorship program for underprivileged youth interested in business careers. Most of these kids have never been on a plane, let alone in first class. They've never stayed in a luxury hotel or eaten at a fine dining restaurant. They have the intelligence and drive to succeed in the corporate world, but they lack the social capital and connections that many take for granted. Richard nodded slowly, beginning to see where this was going. The program needs executives like yourself to serve as mentors, to help these young people navigate professional spaces where they might otherwise feel out of place, to teach them the unwritten rules and expectations of environments they haven't been exposed to. You want me to become a mentor? Richard asked. I'm offering you the opportunity, Mr. Washington corrected. 6 months meeting with a student twice a month, showing them around your workplace, taking them to business lunches, teaching them the ropes. At the end of those 6 months, if you've fulfilled your commitment and our team has received positive feedback from your mentee, your frequent flyer status will be upgraded to our new highest tier, above the current platinum level. It was a generous offer, far more than Richard deserved. And if I decline? Then nothing changes immediately, Mr. Washington said evenly. Your status remains as it is, but I can't guarantee how long that will last. Under our new system, especially if other passengers or crew report similar behavior in the future. The threat was subtle, but clear. Richard knew he was being offered a chance at redemption that he hadn't earned. I'll do it, he said, surprising himself with how quickly the words came out. I'd like to be part of the program. Mr. Washington studied him, as if trying to determine his sincerity. Good, he said finally. My assistant will contact you next week with the details. The fall session begins next month. He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Richard rose as well, extending his hand automatically. Mr. Washington hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. I hope this experience proves valuable for both you and the student you'll be working with, Mr. Washington said. Sometimes, the best way to grow is to step outside our comfortable bubbles and see the world from someone else's perspective. Thank you for the opportunity, Richard said, meaning it more genuinely than he'd expected to. Oh, and Mr. Collins, Mr. Washington added as he turned to leave. My children enjoyed their first commercial first-class experience today, despite the rocky start. I'd hate for their next flight to be marred by similar encounters. I trust that won't be an issue in the future, with them or anyone else. It won't, Richard promised, feeling the weight of the moment. You have my word. With a final nod, Mr. Washington walked down the aisle and off the plane, leaving Richard standing alone in the empty first-class cabin. A flight attendant appeared from the galley, clearly having waited until their conversation concluded. Will you be deplaning now, Mr. Collins? She asked, her tone professionally neutral. Yes, thank you, Richard said, gathering his briefcase and moving toward the exit. As he walked through the jet bridge into the terminal, he spotted the Washington family waiting in the distance, surrounded by what appeared to be airline executives, in suits. Mr. Washington was introducing his children to each person, the boy and girl shaking hands solemnly like miniature business professionals. Richard turned and walked in the opposite direction toward the baggage claim. For the first time in years, his platinum frequent flyer status seemed meaningless, a hollow perk that had somehow come to define too much of his identity and sense of importance. His phone buzzed with a notification. An email from the airline. Changes to our frequent flyer program. Important information for platinum members. Richard put the phone back in his pocket without opening the email. Whatever changes were coming, he had bigger things to think about. Like how he was going to explain to a teenager from a disadvantaged background Why flying first class mattered so much to a grown man that he'd been willing to make children feel unwelcome just to protect his sense of exclusivity. As he rode the escalator down to baggage claim, Richard realized with uncomfortable clarity that he might end up learning more from his future mentee than they would ever learn from him. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what Mr. Washington had intended all along. 3 months had passed since Richard's fateful flight to Los Angeles. The memory of that day still made him wince, but it had set in motion changes he never could have anticipated. Richard checked his watch as he waited in the lobby of his office building. Any minute now, Andre would arrive for their bi-weekly meeting. The 16-year-old had been assigned as Richard's mentee in the Pine Tree Holdings Youth Mentorship Program, and today marked their 6th session together. The glass doors swung open, and Andre walked in, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and khaki pants, a far cry from the oversized hoodie and jeans he'd worn to their first meeting. The security guard nodded to Andre with a smile of recognition, no longer stopping him to ask for ID. "Good afternoon, Mr. Collins," Andre said, extending his hand confidently. "Right on time as usual, Andre," Richard replied, shaking the young man's hand. "And I've told you before, when it's just us, Richard is fine." Andre grinned. "My grandmother would have a fit if she heard me calling an adult by their first name. But I'll try." "How is your grandmother?" Richard asked as they walked toward the elevator. "She's good. She wanted me to thank you again for the flowers you sent when she was in the hospital last month." Richard waved away the thanks. "It was the least I could do. She raised an exceptional young man." The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside. Richard pressed the button for the top floor. "So what's on the agenda today?" Andre asked, adjusting his tie. Richard had taken him shopping for proper business attire during their second meeting, explaining the unwritten dress code of corporate America. The boy had been a quick study. "Today is special," Richard said. "We're having lunch with David Washington." Andre's eyes widened. "The David Washington? From Pine Tree Holdings? The one who started this whole mentorship program?" "The very same," Richard confirmed, feeling a flutter of nervousness himself. He hadn't seen Mr. Washington since their conversation on the plane. Their only communication had been a brief email exchange when Richard was assigned Andre as a mentee. "Wow," Andre breathed. "I didn't think we'd actually get to meet him." "He wants to check in on how the program is going," Richard explained as the elevator reached his floor. "He likes to stay involved, apparently." They stepped into the executive suite of the investment firm where Richard had worked for the past 20 years. His assistant looked up from her desk. "Mr. Collins, your car is ready downstairs whenever you are. The reservation at 11 Madison. Park is for 12:30. "Thank you, Patricia," Richard said. "We'll head down now." As they returned to the elevator, Andre whispered, 11 Madison Park? Isn't that like super fancy?" "It is," Richard acknowledged. "But don't worry about it. Just remember what we practiced about the place settings and working from the outside in with the silverware." Andre nodded seriously. "Outward to inward, never saw a bread plate I didn't like." Richard chuckled at their private joke. During their first dinner together at an upscale restaurant, Andre had been so nervous about the formal place setting that he'd accidentally used his neighbor's bread plate. They'd turned it into a mnemonic device, B for bread on the left like the B in left, D for drink on the right, like the D in right. The car ride to the restaurant was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. For Richard, this lunch represented more than just a check-in. It was a chance to show Mr. Washington that his decision to offer Richard this opportunity, rather than simply punishing him, had been the right one. When they arrived at the restaurant, the maitre d' greeted them warmly. "Mr. Collins, welcome back. Mr. Washington is already seated. Please follow me." He led them through the elegant dining room to a quiet table in the corner where David Washington sat, reviewing something on his tablet. He stood as they approached, his smile genuine. "Mr. Collins, good to see you again," he said, shaking Richard's hand before turning to Andre. "And you must be Andre Powell. I've heard excellent things about you from our program coordinators." Andre straightened his posture just as Richard had taught him. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. Thank you for creating this program." "The honor is mine," Mr. Washington replied, gesturing for them to sit. "Programs like these are how we build a more inclusive business world for the future." Once they were seated and had ordered drinks and sparkling water for all three of them, Mr. Washington set his tablet aside and focused on Andre. "So, Andre, tell me about your experience in the program so far. And be honest, Mr. Collins can take it." Andre glanced at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. "It's been amazing, sir. Before this program, I'd never even been inside a building like Mr. Collins's office. Now I know how to talk in meetings, how to write a proper business email, even which fork to use at a fancy restaurant." Mr. Washington smiled. "All useful skills, but I hope you're learning more than just etiquette." "Oh, definitely," Andre said enthusiastically. "Last week, Mr. Collins showed me how to analyze investment opportunities. We looked at real companies and ran the numbers together. It made me realize that I'm actually pretty good at spotting financial patterns, something I never would have known without this chance." Pride swelled in Richard's chest as he listened to Andre speak. The boy had a natural aptitude for finance that reminded Richard of himself at that age. The difference was that Richard had grown up with a father in banking who could open doors for him. Andre had a grandmother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and the lights on. "And what about you, Mr. Collins?" Mr. Washington asked, turning his attention to Richard. "How has your experience been as a mentor?" Richard took a moment to gather his thoughts. "Humbling," he said finally, "and enlightening. Andre has taught me far more than I've taught him." "How so?" Mr. Washington asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "He's helped me see the world through different eyes," Richard explained. "All the things I take for granted, the ease with which I move through certain spaces, the assumptions people make about me based on my appearance, the doors that automatically open, none of that is universal. Andre navigates a completely different reality every day, yet he does it with more grace and resilience than I could ever muster." Mr. Washington nodded slowly. "That's precisely the insight I hoped mentors would gain from this program. It's not just about teaching underprivileged kids to fit into our world. It's about expanding our understanding of theirs." The waiter arrived to take their orders, and Richard noticed how Andre confidently ordered his meal without looking to him for approval, a far cry from their first restaurant outing when the boy had been afraid to even touch the menu. "I have some news I wanted to share with both of you," Mr. Washington said once the waiter had gone. "Our foundation has decided to expand the mentorship program to include college scholarships for the students who complete it successfully. Andre, assuming you continue on your current path, you'll be eligible for a full scholarship to any college where you're accepted." Andre's face lit up with disbelief. "For real? Any college?" "Any college," Mr. Washington confirmed. "Your grades are excellent, and your mentor reports have been outstanding. All you need to do is maintain your GPA and complete the program." Andre looked like he might float right out of his chair. "My grandmother is going to cry when I tell her. She's been so worried about how we'd pay for college." "She won't have to worry anymore," Mr. Washington assured him. "The scholarship covers tuition, room and board, books, and a living stipend." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. The opportunity being handed to Andre would change not just his life, but the trajectory of his entire family. "Now," Mr. Washington continued, "the scholarship has one additional component I think you'll find interesting. Each summer during college, scholarship recipients will be offered paid internships at companies within our network. Richard, your firm has agreed to be one of those companies." Richard raised his eyebrows in surprise. This was the first he'd heard of it, though he wasn't opposed to the idea. "In fact," Mr. Washington added, "your CEO was quite enthusiastic about the prospect. He mentioned that your reports about Andre have been so positive that he'd be happy to consider him specifically for a position in your department." "I'd be honored to have Andre work with us," Richard said sincerely. Andre looked between the two men, seemingly unable to process his good fortune. "I don't know what to say. Thank you both." "You've earned it," Mr. Washington said. through your own merit and hard work. Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. As they began to eat, Mr. Washington turned the discussion to lighter topics: Andre's interest in basketball, Richard's upcoming business trip to Chicago, the unseasonably warm fall weather. When dessert arrived, Mr. Washington set his spoon down and fixed Richard with a more serious look. "I have one more piece of news, but this one is specifically for you, Mr. Collins." Richard tensed slightly. Despite their pleasant lunch, part of him had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. "As you know, we've been restructuring the airline's frequent flyer program," Mr. Washington said. "The new tiers will be announced next week, along with a completely revamped customer service philosophy." "Yes, I've been receiving the email updates," Richard confirmed. "What you may not know is that we've also been developing a mentor class concept for our transcontinental and international routes," Mr. Washington continued. "The idea is to set aside a small number of first-class seats on each flight for students in programs like ours who have never experienced air travel before. These seats would be subsidized by our partner companies." Richard nodded, beginning to see where this was heading. "I'd like your company to be one of the first partners," Mr. Washington said. "And I'd like you, specifically, to help develop the training materials for the flight attendants on how to make these first-time flyers feel welcome and comfortable." The irony wasn't lost on Richard. The man who had once made others feel unwelcome was now being asked to create guidelines for inclusivity. "It would be a fitting full-circle moment," Mr. Washington added, his expression making it clear he remembered their first encounter perfectly. "I would be happy to help," Richard said, meaning it. "In fact, I think Andre would have some valuable input as well. He just experienced his first flight last month when we went to that conference in Boston." Andre nodded eagerly. "It was awesome, but also kind of scary and confusing. There's so much they don't tell you that you're just expected to know." "Exactly the perspective we need," Mr. Washington said, looking pleased. "Between Richard's extensive flying experience and your fresh eyes, Andre, I think we could create something truly valuable." As they finished their desserts, Mr. Washington's phone buzzed. He checked it quickly. "I'm afraid I have another meeting to get to. But before I go," he reached into his jacket pocket and produced 2 small jewelry boxes which he slid across the table to Richard and Andre. "These were delivered this morning. They're the pins for our new highest tier of frequent flyer status. You two are the first to receive them." Richard opened his box to find an elegant platinum pin with subtle diamond accents. Andre's was identical. "Andre, yours comes with lifetime Platinum Plus status on our airline," Mr. Washington explained. "It's part of your scholarship package. Richard, yours is in recognition of your commitment to the mentorship program, provided you continue through the full year, of course." "Of course," Richard agreed, strangely moved by the gesture. "The funny thing about status," Mr. Washington said, rising from his seat, "is that it only has the meaning we assign to it. Whether it's flying first class, working in a corner office, or having the right address, these things aren't inherently valuable. They're valuable because of the experiences they enable and the doors they open." He looked pointedly at Richard. "The question is, once we walk through those doors, do we hold them open for others, or let them close behind us?" With those words hanging in the air, Mr. Washington shook their hands again and departed, leaving Richard and Andre at the table. "He's incredible," Andre said after a moment of silence. "Yes, he is," Richard agreed. "And he taught me one of the most important lessons of my life." "What's that?" Andre asked, carefully placing his new pin back in its box. Richard thought of that day on the plane, how small and embarrassed he'd felt when he realized his mistake, and how generous Mr. Washington had been in offering him a chance to grow. Rather than simply punishing him, "He taught me that true status isn't about where you sit on a plane," Richard said. "It's about how you treat the people sitting next to you." Andre nodded thoughtfully. "My grandmother always says something similar. She tells me that how you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you, that shows who you really are." "Your grandmother is a wise woman," Richard said. "Now, what do you say we head back to the office? I want to show you the quarterly reports before your next economics test." As they left the restaurant and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Richard noticed a sleek private jet passing overhead. likely carrying someone like he used to be, someone who measured their worth by the exclusivity of the spaces they occupied. He thought about the changes in his life over the past 3 months. His growing friendship with Andre, the shifts in his perspective and priorities, the subtle but significant changes in how he treated everyone from taxi drivers to new clients. For the first time in his adult life, Richard was learning that the true measure of success wasn't how high you climbed, but how many people you brought along with you on the journey. And ironically, it had taken being humbled in first class to finally grasp this first-class lesson.